Yeah, I play this.
I do like my weed.
Oh, do you want?
No, I can speak now.
There is a mic. You have to turn it off.
Do you want this one or do you want this one?
No, I didn't know if there's
This one?
I don't know if I can do that. Do you use it much? Okay, no, but do you use it much? I don't need to, but I
There's a
don't.
lapel, I thought there was a lapel for it.
You can ask this one or you can
But maybe you do for the,
Oh, for the recording.
Or for recording, okay.
would you rather have this one?
I can, what is this, different font? Or I can just stay in one spot. Gabriel?
Okay, so just this?
Just that. Okay, that's fine. Carry on.
Yeah. All right.
Alright. Testing. Yeah, there we go.
I would definitely do it. All those images are all there. Right? So they're good.
yay.
Hi, everybody. Who needs a sketchbook? Anybody? Everybody have their sketchbook? So when you're not here, we can take them out. You need one too? See, I'm so glad I brought them for you. Anybody else? So tonight is going to be a great opportunity to use them. You're about to see some really incredible work here from my friends. And guess what? We're already starting to design our covers. So I'm hoping that you guys are designing your covers as well. All right? Yay! What? Is designing the cover required? You're a graphic designer. You're a graphic designer. He's asking if it's required. Yes, it's required.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
So excited that we have faculty Ron Domingue speaking tonight. Ron currently works full-time at Shutterstock, formerly known as Turbo Squid. Fun fact, when Ron left college, he got a job working at DC Comics. He worked for them for 8 years. He describes himself as a creative technologist. He enjoys working with modernist principles of design and applying them to emerging devices. He is a highly experienced illustration and data visualization specialist with an insight for design technologies. Because he can balance analog and digital illustration, he teaches both illustration classes as well as 3D software design classes here at Loyola. He is constantly exploring the newest technologies by traveling to different conferences and meeting with people around the world. He is currently participating in Unreal Fest in New Orleans this week. You're lucky to have him part of the Loyola's design team. Please help me welcome Ron Domingue.
Happy to see so many familiar faces. Thank you guys for coming out. So my talk is called Ghost in the Machine, Journey into 3D and AI. I wasn't really sure about the title at first. I just kind of thought it was Daniela needed a title, and I said, let's Ghost in the Machine, sounds right. But actually, looking it up, the term was originally used to describe and critique the concept of the mind existing alongside and separate from the body. And in most recent times, the terms have several uses, including the concept that the intellectual part of the human mind is influenced by emotions, and within fiction for an emergent consciousness residing in a computer or artificial intelligence. So I thought it kind of worked out in retrospect. A great Neil Gaiman quote here. Danielle did a pretty good intro on me, so yes, I did work in DC Comics and a couple other comic book companies. I worked with clients such as Apple, the World War II Museum, Gannett, CSE in Atlanta, even locally with companies such as Lucid, Peter Mayer, and Trumpet. Turbo Squid, I've been at Turbo Squid for 8 years. We got recently acquired by Shutterstock, but Turbo Squid is the world leader in 3D assets, namely 3D models. There's a lot of industries that use 3D models. We'll get into that pretty soon, which industries and which verticals that 3D touches. But I was brought on in 2015 to push their product or their plugin called Pixel Squid. And we started off with like 5,000 models that were inside of Pixel Squid, and they were basically models that were sourced from the Turbo Squid library. And we grew those 5,000 models to over 250,000 models now. So it's a huge library of 3D objects, and it's primarily for people who don't use 3D all the time, who are actually more familiar with Photoshop than 3D. So it's pre-rendered models inside of Photoshop. As I mentioned, I've been at Shutterstock since 21, since our acquisition. They're the leader, and they're one of the leaders in stock assets, but they moved on to using footage, 3D studios, so they have a virtual production wing of their company, and music. I'm also a painter, an oil painter, so it's just one of my favorite things. It kind of gets me into sort of this creative flow. Just a quick time lapse. I actually don't paint that fast. I also just got a studio in New Orleans, in Central City. So it's Live-O-Day Hall. It's actually an event space. A friend of mine said, hey, there's a corner of this church. You can have a painting studio in it. Do you want it? And I was like, yeah, I want this studio. What are you, crazy? Yeah, it's great. And what I find, particularly with painting, writing, there's always this idea, what I call creative flow. And creative flow is or flow state is that moment where you actually lose time when you're making something. You know, how many people are familiar when you're just working and you just don't, you don't know when you began or when you're going to end. And I'm always trying to find that moment like of flow state and creative flow. So, living in a world, digital world, our minds are constantly being bombarded with everything. So it can also be difficult, particularly, my world has also been very much 3D and AI lately. And as mentioned before, when we're talking about 3D models, 3D is everywhere. And these are some of the verticals and industries that it's impacting. And so for me, I just started learning, being at TurboSquid, I just started learning 3D. I started with Cinema 4D, Octane, and one of the big things, or one of the revolutions around that time was GPU rendering. And if you guys can remember, like old 3D rendering was these small buckets. You have to go away for a couple of hours before you ever saw something being actually rendered. And with the higher processing graphic cards, you can actually almost see real time what a rendering could look like. And that was the feedback I needed to actually get into it. And now, of course, being at TurboSquid, I had access to, thousands of models, so I can basically, be in the toy house, so to speak, and start lighting things and start exploring ideas and concepts and finding out, like, I can build spaceships, I can create the solar system. And there were so many ideas that were just, flowing through my head. Like, I love these sort of 70s cop cars and concept art, even the Mad Max style of renderings, and just adding atmosphere, and basically kind of creating scenes. Obviously Halloween, so haunted houses and horror stories, but also exploring abstract ideas like working with displacement maps and texturing. Using particle systems, here I use a particle system that's basically generating on a DNA strand. And then futuristic and fantasy UI you can build in 3D. So all of this is was new to me, and it was sort of, how can I take my 2D graphic design skills and kind of push them a little bit further? And 3D was actually, it was almost reinvigorating for me to find 3D at that point in my career. Some of these scenes are actually rendered in 3D, but they're using the Toon shader, and if the Toon shader is pretty interesting because it gives 3D an almost cel-shaded look, like an old school animation. And then one of the biggest things in the industry, or one of the biggest products in the industry, is Unreal Engine. How many people are familiar with Unreal Engine? Right. So it's mainly a game engine, or it was mainly a game engine that was used to create Fortnite, and it sort of expanded itself into video production, movie production, virtual production, and a lot of different industries, much like 3D, where 3D found itself in more industries than it originally was intended for. Unreal is finding itself in that same scenario, and this scene is obviously in 3D. So it's really inside the matrix. And virtual production also being interesting because we're finding uses for these huge LED screens. So how many people have seen The Mandalorian, A House of Dragon, or any? Yeah, so a lot of those movies or shows now are using, instead of the old school green screens, they're actually using LED screens behind them and actually projecting. And one of the great things about this is because they're LED screens, they're actually projecting the light source as well. So you're getting natural reflections. So if you're on Mars, you're going to get a red reflection feeding back to you. And it's something, whereas where you were on green screen, if you were, on The Mandalorian or Iron Man, you would have to go back and post and wipe out all the green reflections. So these LED screens is sort of been a savior for the visual effects industry. And it's an industry that I was not necessarily thinking I could be ever a part of until I got into the 3D. So 3D also was kind of the gateway drug for me to get into virtual production. This is built in Unreal. And I was just experimenting with God rays and atmospherics and volumetrics. And this is just an old church that I actually got from TurboSquid and imported it into Unreal. But I wanted to just kind of give it a mood and learn how to actually use lighting in an interesting way, how I can move the light and actually change how the God rays affected the environment. So as I mentioned, there's Unreal Fest here in New Orleans right now. It's actually a great festival. It actually sells out every year. It was here last year, so it's attracting a lot of people from various industries, as mentioned: film, television, video games, obviously. There's people that are CEOs that have softwares supporting Unreal, supporting the LED screens. So there's obviously a lot of tangents to this industry that go outside of games, and it's interesting because Unreal was probably never intended to be more than just this game engine, but it's been turning into so much more. And interestingly enough, I'm here tonight, but Snoop Dogg is actually at Unreal Fest, so I just literally got a text from my old coworker saying, "Hey, I'm sitting here with Snoop Dogg at the MetaHumans booth." So it's so after I leave here, I'm rushing back to the festival to go see Snoop. So the other vertical we're talking about, I keep saying vertical, but the other facet to my creativity lately has been AI. And this reminded me of a quote from Steve Jobs. And I don't think what he meant was like we're getting away from computers, but the idea of programming is a challenge for a lot of people. And Jensen Huang of NVIDIA's CEO said at SIGGRAPH this year, what AI has done for us is democratized computer science. So it's the most natural language for us is the human language. And if we can give commands and we can give direction in the form of prompts, then it can actually be a useful tool. And we've been seeing it in a lot of different industries. And this is the ChatGPT interface here. How many people have used ChatGPT at all? How many people use it to write papers? I'm just kidding, I don't want out in the body. But there's obviously concerns and problems with AI, right? So, and this comes into, bias, fairness, ethical and privacy concerns, job displacement, security risks, lack of transparency, autonomous systems, super intelligent AI, or the evolution of it, regulatory and legal frameworks, resource consumption, and just the general dependence on AI. Like, is the tool going to be so good that you're always going to be using it for almost everything? And we're seeing it being used like Adobe Firefly. Shutterstock has an AI generator. Dream Studio. I think this is text to image this is maybe Adobe's Designs AI, so you can actually use it to create text, logos, videos, social media, and voiceover, but it is kind of worrisome, but is it doing a really good job at some of these things? And so that's the question we kind of have to ask ourselves, or is it helping us? How many people really like to do banner ads, right? And maybe you just build the initial assets and say, hey, AI goes the rest of the way for you. And I think that's the challenge that we're going to be finding, is how much is it going to be a tool or it's going to be a crutch. And even in 3D, there's actually 3D AI that's actually on the horizon for us as well. So the question, kind of becomes, how do we tame this dragon, right? And so prompts is sort of one of the ways we do that. How many people have used AI, like in terms of like Midjourney or Night Cafe, Dream Studio? I actually had students do some AI examples last week as well. So these are some of my own prompts I actually fed into Midjourney. This is like my first kind of intro, and this was just last year. So this is crazy to think that it's moved along so fast. But this was the prompt I created for the tarot cards. And although you could see, there's not a lot there is a lot there to start with. It looks like a tarot card. It has to be cleaned up. There is sort of this backplate that my ideas, were being generated for me. Maybe the execution wouldn't have been necessarily the same, but it came a long way really fast, and the ideas were there. And not all AIs created equal. Midjourney is really, really good, but there is also copyright issues where it actually scrapes the entire web, and that's been something of a legal issue that Getty has been fighting right now as well. Another prompt. Since it's Halloween, I did like sort of this Gates of Hell thing, but the images on the right were like Midjourney 1. The image on the left was like Midjourney version 4. So you can almost see an evolution of the AI and how there's more fidelity in the left version. Although I do find the right version better, just because even though it's sort of phantasmagoric, I like that it's not very defined, and I can almost add my own ideas and concepts, sort of like a high-fidelity thumbnail. Another prompt, and this goes into actually using it for typography, and it sort of has the same results. It's not necessarily going to be giving you great typography, but it does give you ideas. And I think if you can kind of use it in that way, of course, not everyone is going to use it in that way, but this is one of the ideas or concepts, is to build, ideas or to construct thumbnails. It's actually very good at that. Again, it's not a production image that they're giving you, but there is something there. And I've done these props, but all I did was for this piece was I just got the back plate of the house. And the glowing lights, obviously, but the reflections weren't that good. I used Photoshop's generator to create some more trees. I used Pixel Squid to create the birds and the alligator at the bottom. So this was more of a composite piece, but I did use AI as a backplate. And that gets into how are we going to kind of tame these prompts. And there's actually sites like Lexica that's actually sort of this prompt engineering idea. Although I'm not very fond of the term prompt engineering, it makes it seem like more than it is, like you're actually doing some programming or anything. But it is a term, and there is something to be said about the way you order your prompts and how you word your prompts and how you basically give direction to the AI. Again, this is a Sleepy Hollow piece I did, sort of the same concept. I used Midjourney as the backplate. I used Pixel Squid for the horse and the horseman and the axe and the skulls at the bottom, and I color graded it. So a lot of it, yes, there is AI involved in the initial composition, but I completed it in other applications as well for UI and fantasy UI screens. You know, these were some simple prompts that I actually use these screens and put them into a 3D application so I can get like a reflection behind glass, make it look like an actual computer in a set. And these are some typographic experiments I did using Adobe Firefly. I forgot exactly what my prompts were, but it's just interesting. It's like using wires, using mercury that had a pink tint to it, or sequin, sequence with pink, with a pink tint to it. So it's just interesting some of the experiments you can do with it. And I've actually used it in practical work. Someone was asking me to design their CD cover that had to have sort of this Egyptian feel to it, and this is one of the compositions. And last year I did the Where You At cover, and they wanted to use this voodoo image or voodoo queen image for its cover. And I went in there and obviously still touched it up, but again, the backplate was generated in AI. And it brings the question: what does it mean for the future of art and design? Because the industry is shifting and it's being used more. I like to see it as, for assets. And it does, stock photography is an area that it does affect. And there are companies such as Apple who's very careful in their use of the term AI, meaning they don't even say the word AI. Apple usually says machine learning or neural engine. So, which they are basically having their euphemism for AI, if you will. And as mentioned, Getty has a $1.8 trillion lawsuit on AI plagiarism. But just launched an AI generator. So here's a little bit of hypocrisy in some sense. And the idea is that both Adobe, Shutterstock, and Getty have AI generators, and that they source or they train the AI on their photos. But there's a lot of bleed through on that. So that's going to be an interesting topic going forward. And then the Copyright Office says, AI-generated works are not eligible for copyrights. So if you have a piece that derived from AI, what does that mean if you derived it from AI, if you used other elements from different other applications on top of it? And how many people have seen this piece? It won an AI, it won an AI an award. Interestingly, the artist who submitted it said he didn't break any rules. He was more surprised. I say the artist. I use that term loosely, I guess. But he didn't break any rules. It was supposed to be digitally created. He even said via Midjourney on his submissions, and it was probably a good thing that it won, so people can actually have the discussion early. And I had students what their thoughts were. So how do you run away from it all? Is it something that you run away from? So I actually heard a quote recently. There were like two types of people, and I think it's Chris Do that said it. There's people who run towards technology, and there's people who run away from technology. And I'm obviously the one that runs to technology, because I kind of want to see what's going to happen. I want to be there. I don't want to to be in a corner and saying, oh, wow, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And because we've seen this before in other industries where people run away from technology, and it's not as dystopian as we once thought. But I also have, things that I try to do, and I have a mantra that I use, is create something every day. And that frequency isn't more important than intensity. And I use that in a lot of different areas of my life, whether it's try to run once a day, try to meditate once a day, draw, write, something that you can actually build upon. I'm a big fan of James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. And just small habits have, building effects. You can actually, you can run further if you just run just a little bit every day. You can draw better if you just draw in your sketchbook every day. And one of the artists that I'm been truly fascinated in is amazing has been Beeple. So I was actually fortunate enough earlier this year to go to Beeple's grand opening in Charleston, South Carolina. That was sponsored by Christie's. And Beeple started doing his sketchbooks on social media, I want to say 16 years ago now. And he started just drawing every day. And then he started getting into Cinema 4D. Actually uses a lot of the applications I use, and TurboSquid's actually had a great partnership with Beeple over the years. And so he just built up a huge following because of his everydays, just doing something crazy in 3D every day. I actually like more of his older works, just because he was more sci-fi. He's a little bit more political and satirical now, which is still fun. But he's about 6,000 days of everydays. Like one post a day, and he's never missed a day, never, which is insane for 16 years. And then obviously he caught fire a couple of years ago because he sold an NFT on the blockchain for $60 million. So currently, and so Beeple actually has a studio, and he's doing other arts, and he sells through Christie's. He's currently the third highest paid living artist behind Jeff Koons and David Hockney. So another thing I also encourage my students to do is Inktober. And this is another form of everydays. It's really just a simple exercise of using ink or India ink inside of their sketchbooks. Give them a little bit of fearlessness and make them uncomfortable, because most of the time we're using pencil or using something that we're comfortable in sketching with. Sort of the same concept of drawing with your left hand a little bit. That sense of creativity is going to, lend itself to more ideas. And these are some of my Inktober greatest hits. I've done stuff for, like, Rosemary's Baby and Exorcist, all really happy, joyous things. It is, I feel like October's perfect for this type of stuff anyway, so. But again, this is another thing, you doing, an ink sketch 31 days in a row, you're just gonna have great ideas at some point, and I really do like the exercise, and it's a great habit. And this is what I do kind of say about habits in general. Creativity is a habit, and the best creativity is the result of good work habits. Wow, I flew through that. I didn't think I was going to fly through that fast. Oh, thank you. What's that? I probably subconsciously was thinking about Snoop the whole time, because I think he's going to play a DJ set. That's why everyone's really excited.
Can you tell him why he's coming?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned. So Snoop's here because his son's built a video game, so he's really excited about Unreal, and the opportunity that Unreal provides. Probably for himself, it's really in the technology landscape for him as well. Yeah. It's actually sold out, and tomorrow's the last day. But it was here last year at the same time, so hopefully, and tickets aren't actually that expensive, by the way. But maybe there's an educational thing that we can do. It's like $350 a ticket. But trust me, conferences right now are like 1,200, 2,000, like the conferences I go to, or like I gotta give an organ or something. Jet?
I don't exactly want to put you on blast, but I already looked at your website and teachers have asked me to formulate questions. So when I asked was basically, you briefly mentioned NFTs, and on your website you say that you do them, at least a little bit. And considering that they're both very controversial and now, economically speaking, basically irrelevant as far as I can tell, I guess just like what's I guess like I mean I know you're like I know maybe I'm sorry I'm having trouble.
No, that's if you. Yes, I do have. I still have an NFT. Mostly for me at the time was I wanted to get into that space to understand what the blockchain was about and understand crypto. Again, that was sort of the whole running towards technology idea. I didn't want to not be unfamiliar with it, right? And I hadn't lost money, and people. It was just again. There's going to be some form of blockchain or Web3 technology in the future. It's just, again, obviously the prices of crypto isn't as much as it once was, or NFTs are virtually not as valuable as we once thought they were. But there is something to be said about being in that space very early and trying to understand that landscape.
What are your favorite preferences?
Pardon me?
What are your favorite preferences?
So I like Cinema 4D and Octane is the renderer, but once I got into Unreal and started learning Unreal, and Unreal's free, by the way, on the Mac and the PC platform. It's one of the beautiful things about it. It's just like a huge download. I forget how. I think it's like 86 gigabytes or something. So you have to get coffee and come back before it's. but it is a huge. But it is fun if you have all, because they have an Unreal Marketplace where you can get models and toys, and I say toys. I always call them, because I feel like they're like miniature toys, but models and assets, and you can play around and move them really quickly. You can kind of see what Unreal's about, because it's almost like having a video game that you're playing, but you can actually move the assets, change the climate, change the environment on the fly. And because it's real time, and in game, it's actually very responsive.
I have a question about AI. Like you did that magazine cover for Where Is It At?
Well, yeah, yes.
Yeah, Where Is It At? Like how is there a pricing difference whenever you do something that may not have taken as long as something else? Like if you're doing
I charge the same for that cover as I usually do to them, but you're right. That's something that may come up. Hey, we know you used AI. At the time, you almost kind of get like, hey, I know I knew how to use AI before you did. That's why I get paid the same amount as it's part of the knowledge thing. But of course, I think it's going to be an issue when people feel like AI is saving time, and are we paying for time or are we paying for the experience? It goes back to that idea as well.
So with that cover, did they give you an image?
No, they actually saw a social media post I did, and they said we wanted something similar, used the same prompts, and modified it. I always try to do some touching up, so I don't really believe there's going to be, not at my point, there's a legal ramifications on some of those, but I actually want to make sure I do some modifications to every AI piece that I output.
So you can feed your own imagery in there.
Yes, you can, and it's actually getting better and better at keeping consistent. So one of the drawbacks at the beginning was that it couldn't do the same face, right? You generated the same prompt, you couldn't get the same face. Now they kind of solved that problem. So it's called envelopes inside of Midjourney, and you can put a face as an envelope, and that face can be consistent throughout all the prompts, which is quite fascinating.
So someone can take their own drawings and put it in
Yeah.
on top of that. So it's more of like a digital collaging kind of.
Absolutely, and it really, the prompts or the outputs, when I first used them, they kind of reminded me of the photo bashing technique that I kind of show, like you can actually take photos and create interesting compositions.
This might have been answered, but I kind of got lost somewhere in there. Is there any prompt-based
Yes, there's actually one called Runaway. Runaway, or I think it's Runway. There's a few video ones out there as well. You can actually look those up. They're available as well. I saw Jada. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like illustration. I feel like every discipline kind of feeds into one another. Even like when I look at the AI stuff, when I first looked at the AI stuff, I was like, well, I can draw over that, right? That's like that's a thumbnail, or something I can actually build upon. So I felt like my drawing skills actually even helped me in 3D as well. I know that's weird to think about, but it's the same thing as painting. Some way, I guess in any kind of creative mind, it all interconnects. Yeah, that's interesting because I really haven't been posting a lot of AI work lately because I felt like I have to do a lot of work now before I can really call it my own. In the beginning, it felt like, okay, everyone, I'm just joining in the fun. And then you kind of start seeing it being abused. So again, I like using it like sort of the backplate, or just giving me the bones, if you will, or being an asset, or combining them to make another asset. So yeah, I feel like now I really would go into it more and not just take the raw outputs. I don't feel like, the raw outputs are very, creative, if you will. Anybody else? I'm sorry if I can't see anybody. Wait. It's always changing. It's always changing. Like I said, I didn't see myself getting into, if you asked me in 2015, which is almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I wouldn't have seen myself ever getting into VFX or virtual production. I thought that scope of that was a lot of work, and I just didn't have the track record. But because of the tools that have been released, such as Unreal and such as, GPU rendering, it's actually gotten me closer to that industry. And working at TurboSquid, the same thing. It kind of got me further and further on a path that I just didn't foresee. So I kind of say, like, let me keep going down that run towards technology, and so interesting things will happen. Ooh, it's always like to say it's the one I'm currently working on, but that's always like a contrived answer, right? There's the ones when I did working with the Toon Shader. I found that was really rewarding because it was kind of combining 3D with illustration, and so there was instances where I was doing a sci-fi scene with the Toon Shader. Just felt really creative. You were creating a new look, because sometimes when you're working in 3D, the goal is to get photoreal, whereas the Toon Shader, you're actually coming up with a stylistic look. So I think it does kind of blend all the worlds that I'm familiar with together, and that's where I get really excited. Somewhat, yeah. If you ever really see like how Midjourney does its prompts, they begin with sort of these loose compositions, and the fidelity, they'll show you the percentage, and the fidelity sort of builds up. So it's sort of showing the behind the scenes of how the AI is kind of generating those images. So it basically starts with the composition, and then starts with big shapes, medium shapes, and then little shapes. And I think it just starts building on that. So I do think it's, in a way, like a form of collage and photo bashing. But it's using a whole, like in the terms of, it's using a huge library. Right. Right, and so and that's when you think about it, when you're doing like a photo bash or a collage, you're still relying on your taste somewhat, right? You're using photos that you like. You're using images that you have taste for, and whereas Midjourney doesn't care about what images it's sourcing from.
Right, so like last semester we had collage artists come in, and there was a lot of talk about still copyright, like you're using
Mm-hmm.
people's work, and they had to change it enough that people couldn't recognize it anymore as someone else's stuff. I feel like
Yeah, I often think about it in the same way. It's like when rappers remix music, you still have to have you might use the beats in some of the lyrics, but you still have to make it your own at some point. I mean, and I think rap music's creative, so yeah, or hip hop's creative.
I'm curious that in the time that you've been working with AI, whether you've observed as AI has evolved, if there's more or less range in terms of the kind of aesthetic effects that are created. I guess I'm like, when I see a lot of examples and I just kind of passively consume it, I'm always surprised at how much a lot of different people's work looks rather similar, like maybe the themes or the prompts are different, but that there's an overall.
Yeah, there is, and I think that's the thing. The fidelity is not quite there yet, and I mean they've been solving some pretty good challenges. Like originally it couldn't figure out hands, right? Now it's getting to get, it's understanding hands, but it does have a look to it. I don't see, I actually like the earlier versions of Midjourney because they were maybe more abstract, and it didn't give me everything I needed, it was like, that's enough to get me started. Whereas I think the newer versions, it does seem to be similar, similar feeling. I don't know if, I'm sure it's going to have some evolution to it, but right now it's feeling very, it's feeling very contrived. Yeah, that's so Ace asked if where do you think the industry's heading, because you can't use the same exact prompts, you can't and you can't copyright. I really don't know. That's my honest question, but answer, excuse me. But I do know it's going to be a tool. It has, it's the cat's out the bag. Adobe's already built their generator. It's already in Photoshop. Shutterstock's, done theirs. Midjourney's, so the cat's out the bag. It's and it's actually useful in areas of 3D because we're always constantly we want randomness in textures, right? Textures is an area that, we want a different, I don't want to use the same metal texture that was used in this film, or I don't want to use the sand texture used in this film. And AI is actually good for that. So I do see that maybe AI gets segmented out. And again, I actually like how Apple kind of phrases it by being machine learning or neural engine, meaning that there is AI in their software, but it's more behind the scenes in certain areas that we just don't see it as. Right now, the challenge is in design and art, where people are just doing things and calling it art or calling it design just because it's generated from a prompt. So I don't know exactly where it's heading, but I do see it kind of being used and still being used. Anybody else?
I was just wondering why, if you know the answer to this, why it is that hands particularly.
I don't know. It's one of those things where it's how the computer thinks at first. It didn't understand. It's what the computer saw as a hand, right? So I guess, and then it had to get trained to what a hand really is. There used to be it reminded me there used to be an old software problem called a B8 problem, and computers back in the day couldn't distinguish between the letter B and the letter 8. So I think that's something in that frame. The visual part of it, yeah, and we kind of thought that in the beginning because at some point it's going to be recursive, right? That's what you're kind of hinting at. It's going to have its own. It's going to be feeding its own data into itself. So that's going to be a challenge because now you're going to have, is it going to just be, the same imagery or the same source imagery that it's drawing from? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that might be an issue. And how is it going to? How are you going to keep pushing, the technology if it's just using itself as a source? The idea is that it's going to. Unfortunately, AI pulls from humanity in the arts, so hopefully we are still creating and still writing and still painting and still making things that it can pull from. Maybe it's doing it in a more mindful. Yes. Yes. Why? But we adapt. I think that's something that I kind of look at, like, hey, somebody's still got to be behind, the engineering portion of that. There's something that can actually go, like, oh, if this doesn't exist anymore, you got to find another opportunity. You do have to adapt. I mean, we don't have letterpresses anymore. We should have more of them. But there's things even in design that don't exist anymore. We don't do photostatting anymore, and so things change. Sure, I think there's always going to there are going to be engineers in some form behind it. And there's some editing behind it. Obviously, with engines like Midjourney, you could get pornographic results if there wasn't somebody behind it, or things really gory if you didn't have some sort of censor behind it. Thank you everyone so much.